Welcome to the Behind Beliefs and Behaviors podcast, where we take you on a journey of what is behind the specific beliefs and behaviors that impact individuals and organizations. With our guests, we get to the root cause of what stands in the way of everything from health, wealth, and relationships to leadership, community transformation, and societal progress. From topics on leadership, psychological safety, corporate culture and communication, to parenting, trauma, relationships, personal health, and intimacy, this podcast is sure to get you to the source and provide you practical tips to transform your life one root cause at a time. I am your host, Dr. Maisha Claiborne. I'm a physician, a coach, a consultant, and an expert in trauma-informed communication. The founder of the Mind Remapping Company, I help individuals and organizations better understand the brain, behavior, and the root of false beliefs so that you can more effectively listen, communicate, connect, and create fulfilling relationships and results in your personal and professional life. Join us every Monday morning at 8 a.m. and let's get to the root cause and discover what's behind your beliefs and behaviors. Hi, I am Dr. Maisha, and we are back for another episode. And I am excited to be having another conversation with my partner in transformation, Dr. Jill Wener. Hi, Jill.
Hi, this is so fun. I love doing collaborations with you. We're like both of us separately, but also us together.
Exactly. We talk a lot about the work that we do, conscious anti-racism, being, when we do the work in organizations, how it benefits white people, and especially in terms of their skill set, their resilience to talk about racism and talk about oppression and even how to do this work out in their organizations and their communities. But what we don't often talk about is the benefit of this work to people of marginalized identities. When we first came together in partnership, even as having a lived experience, I felt like that there was so much that I didn't know. I was just so behind the eight ball. And I mean, I'll be honest, I am every single day still learning, learning about history, learning, I'm much more involved in the learning of global events and, with everything that's been going on. And I'll share, like history, growing up as a kid, I didn't like history. Now I understand why I didn't like history. History was boring. History was not interesting to me. And I understand why. And I especially understood why when I started really delving into this work. And so for me, what was so eye-opening was, and part of what we do in our conversations is we do the definitions and we talk about white supremacism culture. And then we go through the specific, characteristics of them. Being able to see where I was occupying some of these symptoms and characteristics and understanding and actually being able to have some sense of self-forgiveness around it, to be able to say, oh, this is the air that I breathe, the water that I swim in, and it was sort of installed and inherited from generation to generation to generation. And that for me was eye-opening, not only from the standpoint of understanding where some of my behaviors came from and some of the things that I had experienced that I couldn't quite put my finger on, but didn't feel good to me. But also it made me look at history a little bit differently. And it actually made me want to learn more about history and how these characteristics came to be and how this mindset came to be.
Yeah. It's funny. It reminds me a little bit, this may or may not be relevant, but like when I was a doctor, I always like hated myself for not reading enough. And now that I do this work, I'm like, all I want to do is read and learn. And it feels like I'm connected into it so much better. And it's like, oh, I'm in the place where I'm supposed to be because so it's very different from what you shared, but it's also kind of like when you connect in with it, when it feels relevant, when it feels.
And it's sort of a sidebar. The other day, my son said to me, this is what made me recognize this. My son said to me, man, I don't like history. It's boring.
Oh.
And when he said that, that's what it brought up for me. And I said to him, I didn't like history either when I was a kid, but I think it's because I never saw myself in it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the way that it was depicted, it wasn't very positive about, my particular identity.
Yeah.
So had I had learned something different, then maybe I would have, really gotten into it more. And perhaps I would have been a little bit further on when I started this work. Not to beat myself up about where I was when I started this work, but just to say, this is why this work is so beneficial.
0 beating yourself up about it. I think having your lived experience is enough, and it is really interesting, in my lived experience as a Jewish person, as a woman, to recognize that whiteness still is there,
Mhm,
even with those identities. So they're both marginalized identities, and race is a part of it. And if I don't learn about anti-blackness, if I don't learn about whiteness, then I'm not showing up fully as myself. And I'm also showing up in a way that is going to be causing harm.
mhm,
And then it's also been interesting seeing the way some of the executives that we worked with during our trainings who
mhm,
are people with marginalized identity, who are black people, have areas of growth
mhm,
because we're human and because there are other identities, and there's this mindset, like you said, it was kind of, you inherited it as we all did.
mhm.
How do we decolonize not just the white people, not just the people with no marginalized identities, but how do we work on decolonizing all of it?
Yeah, and I love the use of the word decolonization because that's very accurate. It's when I think sometimes when we talk about anti-racism work, especially when speaking about people of marginalized identities and particularly Black people doing this work, there can be a mindset of, I don't need anti-racism work. Like I'm Black, like I know about that. And to be honest, there was probably a point in my life where I felt a similar way. Words are so powerful when you think about it in the context of decolonization. It completely changes the mental image in your brain about what this work is. And I think that is more what we do is decolonization work and anti-oppression work. And I do agree, like, for people of all marginalized identities, this work is important, whether you're, for anyone who what's powerful about it is it gives you a sense of what's at the helm of it all,
Mm,
right?
yeah, yeah,
Colonization is at the helm of it all. And white supremacism is at sort of like the root of it all. And it impacts all of us,
yeah,
no matter what identity. And I think it's valuable for someone like me to do this work and to see even where my own biases may be happening with someone who does not occupy my same identity or whose identity I do not occupy,
yeah,
right? And to see the levels of bias from a cultural and a community standpoint, and to understand that still comes from the same root.
yeah, yeah. And one, I guess maybe one other thing that I would want to name also is, you were saying that a lot of Black people are like, "What do you mean? I don't need to do this work."
Mhm,
Honoring and naming, as of course you would do, that like this work can cause harm
mhm,
to people with marginalized identities, particularly Black people, when it is done in a way that's not trauma informed, and when it's done in a way that isn't teaching to them.
yeah.
Just like having people sit and witness like the harms that have been done to them, and watching other people grapple with them is not particularly helpful, to say it lightly. So just kind of bringing that in as well, when there is that kind of trauma aspect to it,
Mhm.
it can make it even harder to engage in the work.
And I think what's really great about the way we've designed the work that we do with organizations is that there is this way that we have this set of tools that we've put into our work that help both all identities that are doing this work manage the discomfort of the work itself.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that's very unique about what we do. So, and then not only that, but then like, okay, now that you know what these symptoms are, these characteristics are, you know the definitions, you know the history, you know what's harmful. How do you navigate, and you know how to even navigate the discomfort of your own thoughts and processes and beliefs and all of that, your fears, all the things. Here's a bridge of now how to communicate and how to manage that in a trauma informed manner. It's going from, as we like to say, insight to action. And then the bridge from, okay, this is how you deal day to day with a human being, but this is how you also put this in the community. Like, how can you take these tools and put it in the community? Because insight without action is just an idea that sort of floats away. And, we know conversations disappear. I've always thought that's really cool about, what we do and what you bring as a mindfulness meditation and also as a tapping instructor is super valuable. And then, the communication aspect of what I bring, in addition to for both of us being trauma informed and both of us having that, and I have some of that mindfulness background as well. It just brings a different lens. The word that I want to use is it empowers people
Yeah.
rather than disempowers people.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's funny, like as you're saying it, for me, my white woman anti-racism journey began well before 2020. But what did start to become much more apparent to me during that time was the way that like meditation and wellness spaces have been colonized and
Mhm,
cultural appropriation and spiritual bypassing and all of that. I think super, super eye-opening to be able to reckon as a wellness practitioner, to be able to recognize the way that shows up and then to teach people and hold space for people from a trauma informed lens rather than from a colonized lens. Now, of course, I'm always going to be colonized. There's no way I can uncolonize it because I am who I am. But having that lens and
mhm,
understanding the way that people are showing up is going to impact their experience in
mhm,
my, you know, tapping session or my meditation session, and then bringing that decolonizing out now back. It's like the anti-racism work got brought into the wellness work, and now the wellness work, the way I started to understand colonization, now is coming back out to our corporate work,
mhm.
through that lens, which I really like.
And by the way, kind of going back to what you said about the wellness space being colonized and the cultural appropriation there as a yogi, I'm seeing that. And there's a lot of creators that are starting to call that in now.
Mm,
So it's nice to just, it reminds me like calling that full circle in the spaces that we don't often recognize as being spaces that are colonized, because a lot of people focus on the corporations and the medical systems. But what about these personal development or wellness or spiritual spaces that are causing harm? And especially when we talk about spiritual spaces, we can go into a whole conversation about the church
mm,
and religious communities, you know, of all identities, mind you, because religion, well, I'll speak specifically about Christianity because that's the background from which I come from, or that's how I grew up, I should say. That is very, very steeped in white supremacism.
yeah,
So yeah, it's interesting when you talk about like these spaces that maybe not everybody pays attention to, especially when we're on LinkedIn, because most people are talking about education and medical and
yeah,
like academic spaces, corporate spaces.
yeah,
We can forget about the other spaces as well.
yeah, absolutely. Do you feel like it might be helpful to talk about a couple like specific examples of how decolonization applies maybe to folks of different identities and how just to kind of illustrate it if what we're talking about for people who may get it already
Mhm.
and also for people who may not know the term colonized or what that would look like.
Sure,
Um,
sure. When I think about it, and you're speaking specifically from other marginalized identities.
Well, I'm just, some of the stuff that we've come across in our trainings that
Oh, yeah.
we've led some of our CEOs,
Mhm.
and their kind of blind spots. The one in particular I'm thinking about is a Black woman CEO who finished our training and was like, "Holy crap! Like I've been using a lot of these characteristics of white
Mhm.
supremacy culture as how I lead
Yeah.
in this big moment." So I guess I would love to hear your thoughts on that moment.
I think that when she shared that, I very much related to that, not as a CEO, but just as a Black woman who had been doing this work and had had that similar experience when we were developing our training and I was doing the work of learning and digging and researching and all of that. Um, the other, I mean, we've seen it a lot. We've seen it in one of the things that actually comes forward for me is thinking when we were in one of the organizations that we work with, we were doing, I think, an opening, and we have a white gay male.
Mm,
One of the things he said that rang for me is that I may be of a particular marginalized identity, but I'm white first.
yeah.
And I thought that was like, huh, okay. Like that's where intersectionality comes into play,
Yes.
and I've heard other white women say the same thing. And I've heard white trans people say that as well. Like it- when the awareness is there that these are marginalized identities and they can be impacted and they can still occupy the symptoms of white supremacism. And even, we, of course, have had trainings with Black men who recognize, like, wow, I didn't realize right to comfort was there so much
Mm,
when they're nervous about making mistakes and marginalizing other communities,
yeah.
right? Perfectionism is there, and being paralyzed because of those fears.
Yeah.
So it just goes to show that whether you are whatever identity you occupy at the helm of some of these symptoms coming up, it's the same, it's the same air.
It's the same air, and it shows up differently in all of us, and it shows up the same in all of us too, I think. Because, like, thinking about, like, a Black man at the head of an organization who's like, "Crap, like, I don't wanna mess up because I, didn't provide, space for people of different religions to have space to pray.
Mhm,
So I just shut down and didn't want, just didn't want to acknowledge it because I didn't want to mess up."
mhm,
Like that's usually the kind of stuff you would hear someone who looks like me say, like, "Oh, I don't want to make the wrong so it's just it
mhm,
shows up that sort of defensiveness and that right to comfort, like you were saying. It is so interesting to see how it shows up in different spaces.
mhm,
And then, you were mentioning white folks who see it with, a white gay man or
mhm.
a white trans person. And then there's other times where it's not seen.
Oh, yeah.
That's obviously, but like when, in white feminism, which a lot
Mhm.
of white women don't know that like the feminist movement was extraordinarily racist and
Oh,
caused
yeah.
a lot of harm to Black women,
Yeah.
continues to, honestly. And until we decolonize that space,
Mhm,
there's always going to be this, but I'm a woman and I understand and I don't need to learn because I already know what it's like to be marginalized.
mhm,
In Jewish spaces, it's taken me, I've like clawed my way out of my own internalized anti-Semitism,
mhm.
which has taken years and finally like shown up in our spaces like as my full identity October 7th. And now I'm like, okay, well, how do I navigate this as like an anti-Zionist Jew? And how do I
Mhm,
show up as that? And how do I don't know, like watch my own right to comfort for Zionist Jews, like to not harm them, but like
mhm.
why am I trying to not harm them? And like Zionist Jews who are kind of a lot of people are seeing like, we're scared. This is our trauma. And there's the yes, and then there's the and. Like,
Yes.
this is our trauma and
Yeah.
so many other traumas. And if we're so focused on our own trauma, we cause harm. We're just as complicit.
Mhm.
None of these other identities get us out of whiteness
Yeah.
or get us out of anti-blackness, I suppose I would say also.
Yeah.
Um, because that's how strong it is. And so I think for anyone listening, I think this work is important for white folks with marginalized identities also,
Yeah.
for people who think like they get it. And I certainly, it's hard to remember like what I thought all the way back then, except I know that I thought I was like not racist, and that I didn't have anti-black bias, or that I wouldn't have
Mhm.
even talked about it like that. So recognizing that it's in all of us in different ways, and what do you call it? The force behind it all. Force wants us to not recognize it
Absolutely.
so that we stay in silos, and that we can like, I'm just going to share a story. Yesterday I was at a hearing at the Georgia state legislature for about a bill that's being passed theoretically to like codify anti-Semitism, that's like theoretically supposed to be, supporting, fighting anti-Semitism, but it's not. Like, it's got a lot of other things. And so we show up, I'm there with like the anti-Zionist Jewish contingency, plus the coalition of Muslim people who this bill would harm, and other groups as well. And we walk in, and the group that's supporting it is the Christian Zionists, and then also Jewish Zionists. So they're there, and they're like my people theoretically, but right now they don't feel like my people, which is its own
Mhm.
whole thing. But then they start the prayer. They start the session with a prayer, a Christian prayer, not the people in charge, the people
Yeah.
on the committee.
Yeah.
And they're like, in Christ's name. And so I'm looking over, and I'm like, see, this is what we used to be part of a community.
Right.
Now it feels like we're holding different signs, but it's keeping us separate.
What's so interesting is the complexity.
Yeah.
And people have no space for complexity. It is this way or it is that way. Like, it's that binary, very harmful binary thinking that is actually one of the characteristics, like this, it's either or. There's no room for complexity. And what you just described is incredible complexity. They used to be my people, but they don't feel like my people. And then in that moment, it was the same. It was
Yeah.
like, huh? And then moments later, it's not the same again.
Right.
Like,
Right.
the complexity that of division that happens. It's interesting, as you share that, it brought to mind colorism for
Mhm.
inside of our communities, inside of the, Black and Latino communities and other communities who are communities of color who have the spectrum of shades inside of their communities. And oftentimes there is quite a bit of colorism, darker skin experiencing more marginalization or more um, harm than lighter skin populations. And even colorism within the community, and then colorism from outside the community as well. So like someone like me who is fairly lighter skinned, there are shades that are lighter than me, and I have been called names that indicate light skinned. So that as a lighter skinned person, I still have more privilege than perhaps my darker skinned counterparts because of colorism. And then at the helm of all of that, and then we have colorism inside of our communities, because let's be clear, inside we know that inside of I hear this so much inside of the Latino communities, particularly inside the Dominican community, as I'm watching, watching content creators. It's a big conversation inside the Dominican community right now. The helm of all of that is, guess what? White supremacism.
Yeah.
Because the closer proximity to whiteness, then, the quote unquote better or more superior. You can see that in, just various other cultures as well. You can see that in the East Indian culture. You can see that even inside of the Middle Eastern cultures. You can see that in certain African cultures. Like, there's a riff in the Egyptian community. You can see that. You can even see that in Far East Asian cultures as well. I mean, like, the colorism happens globally. The anti-Blackness happens globally. And what's just so heartbreaking for me about it is to understand what's at the helm of it and see that nobody really gets that what's at the helm of it is the same thing, and it's designed specifically to divide and conquer. And that's where it even comes from.
Yeah.
White supremacism is divide and conquer.
What are your thoughts on we've talked a lot about, like, the way whiteness shows up in white people, and we talked about, what the way white supremacism shows up in Black folks. What are your thoughts on, like, how it shows up in people who are like, of different racial identities that are not white and are not Black?
I think it shows up very similarly. When you think about what colonization is and what the underlying message is, we could actually talk. Let's talk about, what comes to mind for me is like Irish community. And even though most of the time when you see an Irish person, they look very white, there used to be a time where they didn't, that wasn't what they considered themselves, right? And I think the Greek community, and there's a lot of other communities who look white, but they didn't consider themselves white. By the way, and you know this, like when people think of Jewish people, they think of people who look like you, and they often don't think of the spectrum of shades of skin of Jewish. And so then as a result, the Black Jewish community is completely marginalized and not even accepted. As you already know, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but like it's very interesting to me because I have a good friend of mine she's a Black Jew from Israel. Speaking back to the communities, like the European communities that didn't consider themselves white. Historically speaking, the British came down on anyone who wasn't British, right? And so what ended up happening is these other communities they quote unquote gave up their cultural identities to be proximal to whiteness because they could. And that's how this started to gain momentum, this sort of white supremacism. So your original question, I believe, was how do you think it shows up in people who are not Black or not white? And I think I talked about, they have white skin, but they didn't consider themselves white. So then proximity to whiteness was good. And so then when you go into other communities as these various European white-skinned people go into these various other cultures who have brown skin, the closer that their skin was to looking white, the better they were treated. And thus the internalized conversation is the closer I am to think like, act like,
Mhm.
get rid of my accent.
Right.
I've heard a lot from, especially from like the Asian community who have said, don't like try to get rid of their accent. Latino communities try to get rid of their accent so that they can fit in, so that they are not mistreated as they would be otherwise. So
Yeah,
that's the long way around to the answer to the
yeah.
question.
That's so interesting. 'Cause I feel like and you can share your experience, but I've heard almost like, the way they talk about, like, white silence or white complicity, where it's like there's a whole room of white people and white people just talk differently when there's not someone Black around, like, they're just gonna
Mhm,
say things. That also happens when I'm with people who are not Black, but are not white,
mhm,
and, like, I don't really understand, can't they just, like, pull themselves up by their bootstraps? And, I hear things like this from very, very smart, educated, wonderful people, progressive people
mhm,
who don't see their own anti-Blackness
mhm,
because they have contended with their own racialized trauma and their
mhm.
own perhaps immigrant trauma and everything. And so how does that land? Like, how is it on your end?
How does it land for me? I mean, it lands the same as when, I hate to say this, but for me personally, I'm so I'm so used to it, which is sad to say,
Yeah.
that it doesn't impact me differently from how it does with when white people do it.
Yeah.
I will share that when I first realized it, it was very painful. And when I first realized it, I was so confused and I didn't understand. And I'll tell you when. I worked in New Zealand for 6 months early on in my career. And part of the return, as part of one of the benefits, we got to stop over in a place. And me and my partner at the time, we stopped in Fiji. So, Fiji has a lot of Black people and Black of African descent, but also Black Indians. And when I say Black, I mean like there were for East and in Southeast Asians who were the same skin shade as Fijian Africans.
South Asians? Like people
South
from India?
South Asians,
Yeah,
yes, sorry. South Asians who were the same shade of skin as Black Fijians of African descent,
okay. Mhm.
or the indigenous Fijians are of African descent, the
Yeah.
indigenous Fijians. So I was walking down the street one day, and this Fijian came up to me, and we were walking and talking. And of course, he was trying to, I don't know, he was trying to sell me some watch or something. But he was friendly. We were walking, we're talking. I was like, hey, and clearly he was of African descent. And so as we were walking, um, I don't know how we got to this part of the conversation, but he says to me, you know, the Indians, the people who are from India, they hate us because we're Black. And I was like, what? And I had seen Black people who were of Indian descent
Yeah.
from India. And I was like, how is that possible? You're the same shade of you're the same hue. And he was like, I don't know, man. That's just the way it is.
Yeah.
And it was the first time that I was like, oh, you mean this is everywhere? It's not just in the US? I can go all the way over to Fiji. And then I started to do the research and I was like, oh, this is sad.
Yeah.
So then from that point on, like when you see something, you can't unsee it. So then I could see it. Then I could see it in the Far East Asian communities. I can see it in the South Asian communities. I could see it in, the Middle East Arab communities. I could see it in Northern African communities. I could see it in whatever communities that were not Black. I could see it in Latino communities. And I was like, oh, anti-Blackness is global. So now I think I've just gotten to the point where, I've sort of accepted it is what it is. And this is the work that we're doing.
Thank you for sharing that experience. So when I first started doing anti-racism work, like in real earnest,
Mhm.
I was like, I can't talk about being Jewish. My identity doesn't count.
Mm.
And no one's identity that's not Black doesn't count. You know what I mean? I was very much kind of like, well, you're not Black, so you don't even know. But like, I was really didn't know. But so I think I was so focused on working through anti-Blackness that I was unintentionally, or maybe intentionally, I don't know, but like not honoring the lived experience of people who are not white, but who are non-Black as well.
Yeah.
And so I want to bring that in too. It's like, what a like you're saying, the complexity of, okay, there's this proximity to whiteness thing, then there's also this like my own racialized trauma, then there's also this anti-Blackness thing, and being able to see that control of it all,
Yeah.
the source of it, as one thing
Mhm.
is just so eye-opening.
Yeah.
And I think it's allowed me to bring my whole self in, and it's allowed me to see other people in their whole selves, and to like you were saying, that complexity to navigate that.
Mhm. And then I'll drop one more complexity in the bucket, because across a lot of marginalized identities is also anti-trans, anti-LGBTQI
Yeah.
sentiment. And I mean across all identities, including marginalized identities. And so like that's another complexity. And it's still the root is
Yeah.
colonization, right? Which is wild, because if you look at the history, European history, there was all kind of LGBTQ and I.
Yeah.
So how in the world did whiteness and white supremacism end up marginalizing those communities when
Yeah.
what it is, it's religion.
Mm.
I mean, I'll stop it at that. Because it just popped into like, oh, when I think about how I grew up and reading the Bible and how the Bible has been contorted, and you know, I'll just stop there. But yes, I think that's sort of like how that crept in.
Yeah, I think absolutely, and Islamophobia, and being in obviously there's Muslims in all racial identities.
Mhm.
So anti-Semitism shows up in I've experienced a lot of anti-Semitism from Black people, and then I don't hold it against them, because I know that it's not from a place, the stuff that I've experienced, I will say, is not from a place of hate. It's from a place of not knowing the
Yeah.
ways it shows up. And I can also say, well, I can't really point my finger because there's anti-Blackness in the Jewish community and there's anti-Blackness and obviously in white spaces. So like, how could I point a finger elsewhere without acknowledging my own spots that I'm not seeing?
Yeah. I think at the end of the day, what we have to do is if we can recognize the root when we see it coming up, it's naming it.
Yeah.
Especially if it's something that, like in the instance where we were in a meeting with one of our leaders, and he said something that really was harmful. And it was like could be construed as, or and it, like was experienced by you as anti-Semitic, and you were able to like name it, and it was out of ignorance and not out of malice,
Yeah.
right? And so then in naming it, there was a beautiful connected conversation. Now that's of course not always the way it's going to be, because we know, generally speaking, there's a lot of fragility that happens in people,
Right.
right? Particularly in the white communities. There's a lot of fragility, and there's no resilience around having these conversations and being wrong. But when we name it, then we open the conversation.
Yeah.
And I think that's sort of like what's happening now. And just to bring it around, I like to leave people with hope. I mean, I do like to leave people a little bit of hope. To bring
Mhm.
it back around, I think that we are seeing with social media, and this is one of the things, I used to hate social media, but now not so bad anymore. I mean, contextually speaking, but then you are seeing the conversations from all our identities, marginalized white and marginalized identities, begin to speak the truth about what's at the helm. And I think that we are moving towards a tipping point in this work. I think we are moving towards a tipping point in this work. I mean, I don't know if it's going to happen in my lifetime. And when I see Far East Asian, when I see South Asian, when I see um, like Northern African, Middle Eastern, white European, um, indigenous communities, Latino communities, when I see these communities starting to speak about the helm, the root,
Yeah.
white supremacism, and honor each other, and also honor the experience of anti-Blackness, like what the harm of anti-Blackness, um, it gives me some hope that we're moving in the right direction.
Yeah, absolutely. I just had a moment where I realized we have not really talked about the indigenous experience in the United States at all, which is kind of one of the things that can happen is the like attempted erasure. And so I want to just take a moment to be like, we haven't talked about that experience, and neither one of us have that lived experience. Um, and all these things, I don't know, what thoughts do you have around that? Like kind of bringing what we're talking about.
I think it's very similar, in terms of, well, so here's one thing I'll say about, I don't think there could be a whole podcast on this. Um, but here's one thing I'll say about what I love about indigenous community is they, how do I say this? I feel like they are a strong-minded community because they have held on
Yeah.
they are held strongly to their identities. And if there's one place where I do not see the attempt of proximity to whiteness, it
Mm,
is in the indigenous community.
yeah.
And it is something that I love so much. And at the same time gives me personally a little bit of sadness because of the fact that I don't have that connection.
Mm.
I don't have that immediate connection to that type of ancestry. And so I think that's what I'll say about it for now.
Thanks, Maisha.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, we never know where the tears are gonna come from. We never know where the emotion's
It
gonna
hit me. It hit me.
and yeah, I mean, like, colonization is like, that's the, like, the indigenous people and the Black people in our country are the people who experienced it at the
Mhm.
absolute most intense, at the absolute most harm.
Mhm.
And it just like, impacts perhaps in a different way.
Yeah.
Um, well, thanks for having this conversation.
Man, we could talk all day, and we're gonna and you know what's so fun? What's so fun is that this is the first of many conversations. We've been talking about this for a while, and me and you need to be on podcasts more often. And we finally put it in our calendars to do it. So I look forward to the next conversation. And I will say to the audience, as always, thank you for listening, because without the listeners, there is no podcast. And please share this episode. Please share. Please leave reviews, leave comments, because this is the work that we need to get out there. And of course, um, if you are in an organization or a community that is ready to do the work of decolonization, the work of anti oppression, then you need to go to consciousanti-racism.com. And we also LinkedIn, and come see us.
One last thing to add. If you're listening to this on Conscious Anti-Racism, please follow the Black Mind Garden, which is Maisha's podcast. And if you're listening to it on the Black Mind Garden, please follow Conscious Anti-Racism, which is my podcast.
That is right.
In two spots at the same time.
That's right. That's right. So, all right. Well, then we will see you all on the next episode. Until then, stay empowered. Thank you for listening to our podcast. We know that without the listeners, there is no podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please remember to subscribe so you do not miss when we drop our next episode. And share this podcast with a friend, a family member, and a colleague, at least one person in your life today. This episode was brought to you by the Mind Remapping Company, helping organizations create psychologically and emotionally safe cultures that make their employees and leaders feel seen, heard, respected, welcome, and valued, all while fostering a thriving, engaged, and healthy workforce for the organization. Is your organization in need of a speaker? I speak about topics like psychological and emotional safety, trauma-informed communication, and employee well-being. If this is aligned with your organizational inclusion, belonging, or leadership goals, contact me, Dr. Maisha, by going to www.mindremappingacademy.com. That's mindremappingacademy.com. Finally, we train leaders, but we also train coaches. If you're interested in becoming a trauma-informed coach, visit our website as well and check out our NLP coach trainings and certifications. We'll see you on the next episode. Until then, stay empowered.